Although many military experts opposed the Inchon assault, it developed into a brilliant success that exceeded MacArthur's own expectations. In the south, General Walker broke out from the Pusan perimeter on September 23rd. 3 days later, the 1st U.S. Cavalry and the 7th Division linked at Ochen, trapping 23,000 North Korean soldiers. The pursuit of the NKPA now became a rout. Trapped, the North Korean forces west of Ochen were smashed. Those to the east collapsed as they attempted to retreat north. Many of the communist soldiers took refuge in the Taebae Mountains as guerrillas. By the time they were back across the 38th parallel, the North Koreans had lost over 150,000 men. The UNC captured 125,000 prisoners. UNC losses in the offensive were 18,000. Inchon was a stunning and brilliant victory for the UNC. The threat to South Korea was completely reversed and the NKPA virtually annihilated. After driving the North Koreans back beyond the 38th parallel, UN forces were faced with a difficult decision.
I remember the debate, and there were some hard feelings about it. You know, whether you cross that parallel and in pursuit, and total defeat and reunite Korea, and whether or not you limited action. So the limited war, there was those that against limited and had strong feelings about it, and of course MacArthur was against it and wanted to pursue.
The problem came when we got to the 38th parallel, and MacArthur was willing and wanting to go across the 38th parallel to invade North Korea and end this thing once and for all, because he said, if I go back to Japan, these guys are just going to come back.
While MacArthur's maneuver warfare was outstandingly effective in annihilating the North Koreans, it did not create a stable basis for peace. The suddenness and decisiveness of the victory greatly threatened the Soviet Union and the PRC. American entry into the Korean War greatly concerned the Chinese Communists. An American victory in Korea would threaten their security and ideological interest. Accordingly, on July 13, 1950, 4 armies were dispatched to the Korean border from the Northeast Border Defense Army. They were ordered to defend China's border and support operations of the North Korean armed forces.
The Chinese had warned the United States, they had warned Great Britain, they had said in numerous messages that if you invade and go across the 38th parallel, we're coming in.
In fact, Mao and Premier Zhou Emilia viewed the American intervention as part of a grand plan to control East Asia.
There was a concern that the war would spread and that China would be in war with China and would be in war with Russia. So that was a big part of the debate. There was fear that this would happen, and they wanted to exercise due care not to create that situation.
On September 27, 1950, General Douglas MacArthur received a directive from President Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff detailing further military action in Korea. While the directive's second section listed his military objective as the destruction of the North Korean armed forces, it also cautioned him against any action that would bring other communist forces into the war. On September 30th, the issue of invading North Korea was brought before the United Nations.
And then that became a very issue for the UN, and then had to make a decision in the General Assemblies because the Soviet Union was going to veto anything in the Security Council.
The UN voted to conduct operations above the 38th parallel and gave the task of capturing Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, to the 8th Army.
Even though most Americans and most people felt it was the right thing to do to go ahead across the 38th parallel, we see that General MacArthur was certainly that way. People hesitated and allowed it to be the vote taken, in which actually only 5 countries voted against it, and 47 voted for it to go across the 38th parallel, even though the original mission as we saw it, was to take North Korea and push them back across the 38th parallel.
It also called for the unification of Korea under a democratic government that would be elected by the Korean people. After the elections had taken place, UN forces would leave Korea.
But many people saw that the original intention was to have a unified Korea under the auspices of something like the UN, because we had agreed to this at the Cairo Convention of 1943, and that was the justification they gave.
On October 1st, MacArthur issued a radio broadcast addressed to the Commander-in-Chief of North Korean forces, demanding their surrender. His request went unanswered. For Mao and the CCP, the annihilation of the NKPA increased the threat that the U.S. posed to China. The battle line was rapidly approaching Manchuria, a vital industrial region. The American landing at Incheon also shocked Stalin. If the U.S. occupied all of Korea, the entire balance of power in East Asia would be upset. American forces would be directly on the Soviet borders as well as China's. But Stalin was not ready for a direct confrontation. Therefore, he asked if Mao was in position to intervene. He promised military equipment and the Soviet Air Force, which would provide air superiority over the Chinese armies. Mao did not respond to Stalin's request until October 2nd. In a telegram to Stalin, he confirmed that a portion of the PLA would be sent to Korea as the Chinese people's volunteers. Although he expected American retaliation against Chinese soil, Mao's goal was nothing less than the decisive annihilation of the UNC forces in Korea. He knew that a stalemate would drain China's resources. This thunder out of China was of no effect. In the UN General Assembly, a debate on Korean policy ended with a vote that since unification has not yet been achieved, all appropriate steps should be taken to ensure conditions of stability throughout Korea. If the language was a little vague, the UN resolution was of great importance, for it signaled a change in the mission of the UN forces from repelling aggression to one of uniting Korea by force of arms and ensuring stability by territorial occupation. The point was emphasized by General MacArthur's statement that if cooperation in establishing a unified Korea was not forthcoming from the North, military action would be taken to enforce the decrees of the United Nations. That night, MacArthur again asked for the surrender of North Korea and again received no reply. Meanwhile, the 8th Army approached the 38th parallel. MacArthur was hypnotized by the allure of a total victory and disregarded the repeated warnings from China. Neither did many in the American government take the warning seriously. Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall even told MacArthur that the government wanted him to feel unhampered tactically and strategically to proceed north of the 38th parallel.
That whole issue is that you got to understand, MacArthur is a soldier, is an old soldier who believed that the only thing war is good for is you got to have victory. So he was going to annihilate these people and annihilate this government so they would never come back. And he was going to drive them to the Yalu River, which is the borderline between Manchuria and North Korea.
300,000 screaming Chinese were not going to let that happen. On October 1st, ROK troops crossed the 38th parallel, followed by the rest of the 8th Army on October 7th. Despite the increasing momentum to unify Korea, Truman was concerned about the repercussions of crossing the 38th parallel. He arranged a meeting with MacArthur on Wake Island to discuss the situation. At the hugely publicized meeting on October 15th, MacArthur reassured Truman that there were no signs of Chinese or Soviet intent to intervene.
MacArthur was independent. He liked to be independent. He didn't want to have, even though he knew the military protocol and who he reported to, he was still independent.
MacArthur, as far as I was concerned, was insubordinate at that meeting. In a way, he conducted himself as if he was the commander of the, as the president was the commander of the forces. But MacArthur assured President Truman that the Chinese were not going to weren't going to be there in force, and I think he thought that if they did, it would be a problem for him.
MacArthur's attitude toward this when they told him was, the Chinese were lousy fighters in World War II. They're weak. There's nothing strong about them. I don't fear them.
Back in Korea, MacArthur deployed his corps on diverging lines of advance. The 8th Army advanced in the west. The 10th Corps, still acting directly under MacArthur, conducted an amphibious landing at Wonsan. The port of Wonsan was perhaps the best port on Korea's eastern coast. Seizing it would provide UN forces with another logistics support seaport, one closer to the battlefronts than Pusan, and with greater handling capacity than tide-encumbered Incheon. Despite the bombings of the summer, the Wonsan docks remained, to all intents, undamaged. The town had rail and road connections with the East Coast routes, with the Seoul Corridor, and with Pyongyang. As a final bonus, the base of Kalmapundo held an excellent airfield, originally developed as a Japanese naval air station. On October 12th, the 1st Marine Division sailed to Wonsan, but before the Marines reached their destination, the Navy found the harbor of Wonsan seeded with thousands of Soviet mines. Making matters worse, the United States had largely dismantled their minesweeping forces after World War II, and only one sweeper remained fully operational in Korea. On October 10th, UN minesweepers arrived in Wonsan. With the landing scheduled for October 20th, they had only 10 days to complete their work. The Marines spent a week cruising about the Sea of Japan, while a hastily assembled group of wooden and steel hull minesweepers teamed up with Navy aircraft carriers and dive teams to carve a path through the minefield. On the afternoon of October 19th, the transport and tractor groups of the landing force arrived in the Korean Gulf. The flagship Mount McKinley, with the attack force and Marine Division staffs, moved in and anchored in the swept channel area. The remaining ships were ordered to reverse course and so maneuver as to return at daylight of the 21st. Further delay brought repetition of these instructions, and until the morning of the 25th, the attack force steamed back and forth, first south and then north again through the Sea of Japan. Beginning at 1500 on the 25th, the ships of the attack force moved in column through the swept channel to drop anchor in southern Yonghong-min. When the 1st Marine Division landed at Wonsan on October 26th, they found the ROK Army in possession of the city. In these circumstances, General Almond's force found its mission changed. The speed of advance into North Korea had obviated the need for a westward thrust by the units of 10th Corps. A new scheme of maneuver had consequently been developed by GHQ, and 5 days before the Wonsan landing, 10th Corps received orders to advance to the north.
After we cleared everything north of Seoul there for a short distance, we went back to Seoul, loaded ship again, went all the way around the peninsula, and went in for the Wonsan landing in about August. But this thing had been cleaned out by the time we could get around on the ships, been cleaned out by the ROKs, the Republic of Korea Army, and we just made an administrative landing.
After their entire force landed at Wonsan, General Almond's 10th Corps proceeded to the Chosin Reservoir. It was at Chosin Reservoir that the Marines would make history in fire and ice. While the 1st Marines were preparing to land at Wonsan, UN forces under General Walker were rapidly advancing on North Korea's capital at Pyongyang.
They went into a maneuver called exploitation, which whenever a battle has been fought and there's a disintegration, the battle has been won and there's a disintegration of the defeated forces, they are disorganized and they're easy to defeat, and so pursuit is a maneuver where you risk more than you would ordinarily. So you're not organized, tucked in, so to speak, so that you can get in trouble in a pursuit. And in this case, they were pursuing on a wide separation between major forces. You had the 10th Corps on the east flank, and it wasn't under the 8th Army commander, General Walker, and you had the 8th Army on the west side, and both of them were in pursuit. And the Marine Division was concerned about it and was actually dragging his feet a little, and to kind of maintain a little more organization so that he could get into the defensive posture if he needed to.
By October 15th, several elements of the UN forces under General Walker were within 30 miles of Pyongyang. The Republic of Korea soldiers who'd been given almost a week's head start were making particularly good progress. The South Korean soldiers put together a string of victories in the mountains southeast of Pyongyang. As UN soldiers continued to gain ground, the North Koreans had increasing difficulty organizing defensive positions. As the UN forces approached Pyongyang, on October 19th, North Korean soldiers blew up several bridges around the city before joining their government in a general retreat. After securing the city, MacArthur recognized the communist retreat as an opportunity to capture high-ranking North Korean officials and to possibly rescue American prisoners of war. Immediately, he ordered the 187th Regimental Combat Team to be flown north of the retreat and hold a blocking position along the Chongchun River. Flowing inland from the Yellow Sea, the Chongchun River provided the last natural obstacle before Manchuria's border. If the retreating North Koreans managed to cross it, they would have a clear path to China. On the morning of October 20th, the 187th Combat Team landed successfully and quickly set up their defensive lines. With the blockers in place, UN forces under General Walker surged towards the Chongchun River. In a few days' fighting, the North Korean rearguard was decimated, caught between Walker's men and the 187th. However, the North Korean government had left earlier than UN forces anticipated and made it safely across the Yalu River. Making matters worse, only a few UN prisoners were rescued because of the battle. As the North Koreans retreated, they left a string of graves behind them. On October 21st, UN soldiers discovered a mass grave near Sunshan. In it, they discovered the bodies of nearly 100 American prisoners. A few prisoners managed to survive the massacre by faking their deaths and hid in nearby bushes until they were discovered by UN soldiers. They had been riding a prison train heading north when it suddenly stopped for dinner. 100 prisoners were let off the train and sat down as they waited their turn. Instead of feeding them, the KPA soldiers opened fire. UN soldiers would find other graves as they continued north. After the Battle of Chongchun River, MacArthur had to decide his next move. He was already venturing dangerously close to the Manchurian border, and proceeding further risked war with China. With little hope of a North Korean revival, it seemed as if the Korean War was over. Most people were satisfied with what UN forces had accomplished. However, on October 24th, MacArthur ordered his men to continue their advance to the Yalu River. Their objective, Chosin Reservoir. Known by Koreans as Shungjin, the Chosin Reservoir was home to an important hydroelectric facility. Located 78 miles north of the Korean port city of Hungnam, traveling to Chosin Reservoir presented several difficulties. Reaching the southern tip of Chosin Reservoir meant traveling along a one-lane gravel road from Hungnam through the Taebei mountain range, the treacherous Fushilin Pass, and several Korean villages. While MacArthur had no doubt that his men could make the journey, he worried that enemy forces would take advantage of road-bound artillery, tanks, and supply trucks traveling along the route. Making matters worse, temperatures were plunging as Siberia's winter winds passed over North Korea. The U.S. military entered the Korean War with largely the same uniforms and equipment, subject to minor modifications, as those used in World War II. This was the case because the clothing and uniforms of World War II had undergone rapid adaptation under the pressure of the war and were very well suited to the technologies of the time and to battlefields all over the world. Cold weather conditions encountered in Korea in the winter of 1950 and 51 caused considerable suffering and loss of effectiveness of U.S. troops, whose supplies of cold weather clothing did not reach them in time for their first winter in Korea. While well-designed clothing was in the system, efforts to work off existing supplies of M1943 pattern and post-war pattern clothing kept the newer, more effective clothing from ramping up to full production. While General Walker's 8th Infantry dashed through North Korea, stretching their supply lines as they went, General Smith's Marines took a more cautious approach.
And the Marine Division was concerned about it and was actually dragging his feet a little. And to kind of maintain a little more organization so that he could get into the defensive posture if he needed to.
After leaving Wonsan, Smith's Marines traveled north to Hungnam, where British reinforcements awaited them.
And that's where I got into all my trouble, was that Chosin Reservoir campaign. We got up to Hungnam and Hamhung. Hangnam was the port town, or I should say Hungnam was the port town, Hamhung was kind of the capital of the province up there. And a group of Royal Marines, the 4-1 Commando, 41st Commando of Royal Marines came in, 235 strong, and it was like a heavily reinforced company. And my tank battalion got the commitment to take them up to the front lines, which the division general had just moved up to the town of Hagaru, right at the base of the Chosin Reservoir. So 22 of us trucks roll down to Hungnam, pick up these 235 British Marines and all their gear, and start up. And we got up to about 60 miles up to a little town called Kodori, where Chesty Puller, the famous Chesty Puller, had the 1st Marine Regiment right there.
Like their commander, UN forces driving towards the Yalu River thought the war was nearly over. As the Marines were landing at Wonsan on October 26th, Republic of Korea soldiers reached the Yalu River. As with much of their advance since crossing into North Korea, the South Korean soldiers were far ahead of their UN counterparts. Then the 6th ROK Division arrived at the Yalu River on October 26th. There were no other soldiers within 30 miles of their position. Or so they thought. Out of sight, thousands of Chinese soldiers lay waiting on the river's opposite bank. The CPV, unlike the NKPA, was poorly equipped. It lacked artillery and was not mechanized. Logistics were primarily organized through civilian laborers who carried supplies to the front on foot. Thus, the CPV could not advance far without suffering supply difficulties. However, tremendous manpower and a strong base of recent combat experience offset these disadvantages. Most CPV soldiers had experienced combat in the large field operations at the end of the Chinese Civil War. They were experienced at bold encirclement movements and attacks at night.
Well, as it turned out, they'd infiltrated 2 Army groups across the Yalu River down into the peninsula and were waiting for that pursuit that was coming.
As Chinese soldiers came across the Yalu River and attacked the 6th ROK Division, they took UN forces by complete surprise. This was the first phase offensive. It soon became evident that MacArthur had underestimated the resolve of the Chinese communists. 300,000 Chinese troops had crossed the border into North Korea, with another 400,000 on the way. As Walker ordered a tactical withdrawal, MacArthur believed that only a small number of Chinese troops were actually in Korea, and that a quick advance would preempt additional intervention. On November 24th, the UNC resumed the advance. Expecting a quick and painless end to the war, UN soldiers and officers advanced recklessly. Formations became strung out and did not take proper precautions against a counterattack. Rumors spread that the American troops would be home by Christmas.
He also miscalculated that even if they would come in, even when they did come in, he thought there were only 60,000 of them. Turned out there was 120,000. He really miscalculated on the number of troops that were there. He also miscalculated on the fact that they were going to use the suicide waves. He never anticipated that. That was something he should have anticipated based on the Japanese kamikaze, and it's the Asiatic mentality. But there were just things that he assumed were going to happen.
On the evening of the 25th, the CPV sprang upon the renewed UNC advance, the second phase offensive. The assaulting Chinese infantry moved off the road to encircle and then overwhelm the UNC units. Lacking sufficient radios, the Chinese used bugles, drums, and other instruments to coordinate their movements. The surprise attacks were disorienting to the average UNC soldier. The 6th ROK Division, which had been instrumental in the UN's drive through North Korea, was annihilated in a matter of hours. The Chinese soldiers then continued south and confronted General Walker's 8th Infantry Division.
They hit the 8th Army pretty hard and captured some troops. And then the 2nd Division got in real serious trouble running the gauntlet, Corps-sized ambush in a valley between two mountains. That was a long distance to get through, and that division lost command control at all levels. So just a group of people walking through that valley, being shot at from both sides, and suffering severe casualties. I think around 4,000 casualties, enough to make the division non-combat effective. So they had to withdraw the division and refit it and fill it with replacements.
The Chinese had proven that they were not a force to be taken lightly. UN forces pulled back to the Zhongjin River and quickly formed a defensive position. The 8th Army was threatened with encirclement. Meanwhile, at Wonsan, the Marines were preparing to begin their advance to the Chosin Reservoir.
And then the Marines are over with the 10th Corps over on the east side of the peninsula and up at a place called reservoir called Chosin. They were hit by a corps, by the Chinese army. And if they hadn't exercised a great deal of skill, they would have been wiped out.
The Marines who fought at the Chosin Reservoir would etch their names in Marine Corps lore. While General Walker's 8th Infantry had dashed through North Korea, stretching their supply lines as they went, General Smith's Marines took a more cautious approach.
And the Marine Division was concerned about it and was actually dragging his feet a little. And to kind of maintain a little more organization so that he could get into the defensive posture if he needed to.
After leaving Wonsan, Smith's Marines traveled north to Hungnam, where British reinforcements awaited them.
And that's where I got into all my trouble, was that Chosin Reservoir campaign. We got up to Hungnam and Hamhung. The Hangnam was the port town, or I should say Hungnam was the port town, Hamhung was kind of the capital of the province up there. And a group of Royal Marines, the 41 Commando, 41st Commando of Royal Marines came in, 235 strong, and it was like a heavily reinforced company. And my tank battalion got the commitment to take them up to the front lines, which the division general had just moved up to the town of Hagaru, right at the base of the Chosin Reservoir. So 22 of us trucks roll down to Hungnam, pick up these 235 British Marines and all their gear, and start up. And we got up to about 60 miles up to a little town called Kodori, where Chesty Puller, the famous Chesty Puller, had the 1st Marine Regiment right there.
As the Marines continued to march north through a treacherous terrain in sub-zero temperatures, Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River in force, officially entering the Korean War. Some of General Smith's men were resting at their regimental camp when they first heard the news.
And on Thanksgiving Day, we found out about China being in the war, and we had orders to, within 30 minutes, to head north. Our 1st Marine Regiment headed north without my company. My company, G31, was chosen to stay behind, and we were told the reason we stayed behind was to clean up the regimental camp.
By November 30th, elements of the 2nd U.S. Division met with the forward position of the 27th Commonwealth Brigade, which was attempting to relieve them. Meanwhile, the rest of the 9th and 1st U.S. Corps retreated to safety via Anju on the west coast. Battered, bloody, and weary, the American troops had lost all cohesion. Meanwhile, General Smith ordered his Marines to proceed north quickly to support Army units being overrun by the Chinese Communists. But the winter winds, mixed with an already treacherous terrain, slowed the advance considerably. On November 17, 1950, the 7th Marine Regiment reached Hagaruri, located on the lower end of the Chosin Reservoir, and waited for Smith to bring up the rest of the division. On November 25th, the Marines received reports that 8th Infantry had been defeated by Chinese People's Liberation Army units and were being driven back towards the 38th parallel. The UN victory, which had seemed so close, was now in jeopardy. As General Smith slowed the Marines' advance north to contemplate his next move, 120,000 Chinese soldiers waited in the Taibei Mountains. General Sung Shi-lun, the commander of the PLA 9th Army Group, had watched patiently as the Marine Division advanced toward Shajin. Possessing both superior numbers and the element of surprise, General Shi-lun wanted to make a statement by annihilating the Marines. General Smith pushed the division hard to get his men to the Yalu River. During a blizzard on November 27th, 2 Marine regiments moved up to Udemni. From there, the Marines had hoped to travel cross-country and join up with General Walker's advancing 8th Infantry, dealing a fatal blow to remaining North Korean forces and cutting off the advancing Chinese. The link-up would not take place. The 1st U.S. Marine Division was an elite formation. Many of the Marines had extensive combat experience in the Pacific War. This foundation of combat experience was one of the major reasons that the Marines performed well in Korea. Another was the degree to which the Marines emphasized loyalty and unit cohesion. The Marines were committed to standing together and fighting it out in difficult situations. On the night of November 27th, the Chinese struck. That night, with temperatures registering minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind howling, elements from 3 Chinese divisions struck the Marine vanguard at Udamni. They cut off the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments at Udamni and surrounded the 1st Marine Regiment at Hagaru and Kotori. The Chinese concealed themselves on the hillsides overlooking the road and maintained a constant rain of small arms fire on the road-bound Marines. They used satchel charges, grenades, and mortar shells to destroy the Americans. General Sung Shi-lun tried to overwhelm the isolated Marines quickly so that he could focus on Hagururi.
The first time we ran into this, it was, now if you heard the story about Korea about the bugles, they literally had the bugle. And and I hear the thing at the ball game, kind of a charge, whatever they do, bugle charge, whatever. And when they come in droves. They come in droves, and as quick as they come, what's left, they leave the same way. They'll hit your line and keep coming, and you shoot until you just can't shoot anymore, and then either they retreat for lack of personnel, or they just get tired and pull back. Now you got to regroup, re-ammo, and start all over again. But I think what they did is that, are you familiar with the Civil War, how they fought? Okay, they just go in numbers, and until sooner or later, the last man gonna come through, and that's kind of the way they did. They would come and go and keep falling, until maybe the last man, some reason they pull back on you. But meantime, you exhausted back here. You done fired, and then you probably out of ammunition, or you sick to the stomach because you done seen all this.
For 2 days, Marines held their position against 8 Chinese divisions, while in Western Korea, Walker's 8th Army reeled back from the Yalu River in a massive retreat. The Marines managed to turn aside the first few attacks but were eventually overrun. By the following morning, PLA forces controlled the high ground surrounding Udamni. At dawn, the tired Marines launched a counterattack designed to drive the enemy back. After scaling the hill's steep slopes, the Marines were drawn into heavy hand-to-hand combat against PLA defenders. The battle raged for several hours as Marines managed to wipe out an entire Chinese company and recapture the hill. In completing their objectives, the Marines had suffered heavy losses, as nearly 200 of their men died in the morning's actions. The regimental commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Murray and Colonel Litzenberg, met in the early afternoon to discuss their position. Both men agreed that the costs of advancing further were too great and consolidated their position instead. Almond panicked and ordered the 1st Marine Division and Army units east of the Shajin Reservoir to fall back to the port of Hungnam on the Sea of Japan. At 4:30 p.m., the Marines received orders from General Smith to head south. All hopes of reaching the Yalu were now lost. The 7th Infantry Division and the IROK Corps responded to the order with eagerness, but the Marines regrouped at Hagaru because General Smith decided upon a different plan. After driving the 2 Marine regiments out of Udamni, General Sung Shi-lun turned his attention southeast to Hagururi. Within a few hours, General Smith's forward command post was in danger as Chinese soldiers surrounded the base. Smith would need reinforcements quickly if there was any hope of repelling the Chinese advance. This relief would come in the form of a task force organized by Chesty Puller. On November 28th, Marine reinforcements arrived in Kotori.
We got to Kotori and spent a night, and it was probably 10 or 11 more miles that we had to go. And right after we got to Kotori, while the British 41 Company of Royal Marine Commando, they came in the village that night right behind us.
Consisting of both U.S. and English Marines, these fresh troops were assigned to the newly formed Task Force Drysdale. Organized by Chesty Puller, Task Force Drysdale's mission was to provide relief for the Marine base at Hagaruri. Getting to Hagaruri would not be easy. An entire Chinese division stood in their way.
We stayed overnight because it was dusk, and they said there's about 10,000 Chinese. There's a division of Chinese in this little valley between you and Hagaru where you're trying to get to. It's only 10 miles, but there's a whole division out there going to try to stop you.
The harsh North Korean winter would also prove a daunting adversary.
When we first got into Coterie, I understood it was 25 below zero. It was very cold. We got up the next morning out from under, in our sleeping bag, out from under 2.5 inches of snow.
In these adverse conditions, the Marines struggled to keep their supplies and equipment in working order.
Something like they gave a different version of it. Anywhere from 25 to 30 below zero. Okay. Then you got all kind of problems now. You got food problem, you got ammunition problem, and you got dig holes and foxhole. And where we dug foxhole is like you take a piece of ice and just chip it around and go down as far as you can go and go under, just like you would a piece of sod. And that's what we did, a little to make a, and it served its purpose because those pieces of frozen ground became our bunkers to a point. Because you take your pick and shovel and go straight down as much as you can, 4 to 6 inches down in the ground. Then you go under those pieces and then chip them out, and then you just kind of like a brick wall around your foxhole.
We had a 10-in-1 ration that my 8-man machine gun squad divided, and it was frozen so much that we had to use a bayonet to separate chunks of pork and beans for a breakfast meal.
With time running out for the Marines at Hagaruri, Task Force Drysdale began to move out early on November 29th.
Well, so by the next morning, we had a tank company of 17 Marine tanks leading out the convoy. We had 140 wheel vehicles, what we call thin-scale vehicles, trucks, jeeps, weapons carriers, such as that, wheel vehicles. And then when things got going rough and it was getting toward dark, they got another tank company, Baker Company, from our battalion to bring up the rear. So we had over 900 troops by this time and 170 vehicles in this convoy trying to get from point A to point B 10 miles away. But there's 10,000 Chinese up there from both sides of the road shooting at us.
As Task Force Drysdale moved out, a newsman asked Chesty Puller how he felt about being surrounded by Chinese forces. He responded by saying, "We've been looking for the enemy for several weeks now. We've finally found them. We're surrounded. That simplifies our problem of finding these people and killing them." Even though the Marines had finally found their enemy, destroying them would prove anything but simple.
We was given orders to go to the second hill, and the British commandos go to the first hill, to take those 2 hills, and then they were going to come through us and take the 3rd hill. We were to go through them and take the 4th hill. But it didn't work that way. There was too many Chinese, and we were stalled on those 2 first hills most of the day.
The Chinese soldiers waited as Task Force Drysdale headed right for them.
The Chinese were smart enough to let the armored vehicles through, the tanks. They only managed to knock out 1. And they let about 1/3 of the wheel vehicles. And that was all of the wheel vehicles from this George Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, George 2-1, got through. And about half of the Marines of my unit. And then they stopped the convoy, knocked the engines right out of a couple of the trucks with heavy machine guns, and then swarmed all over. And of course, we had to jump off the trucks and get in the ditch and start fighting back. And the rear third of the convoy, including the tanks company in the rear, was able to turn around and go back. They couldn't come up to help us. The road was too jammed with vehicles. But they turned around and went back in about 1/3 of the vehicles. And so here's this middle third, about 300 of us, that were trapped in there and couldn't go either way.
With limited options, the commander of the British commandos radioed General Smith at Hagaruri for help.
They had radioed ahead, the British commander had radioed ahead. In fact, the task force we were in was given his name, Task Force Drysdale. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Royal British Marines. And they had radioed ahead that the fire was getting heavy, and the commanding general up at the Division CP says, "You got to get through at all costs. We need help up here. We're surrounded too." So we tried to push through.
Pushing through would prove no simple task. Shortly before nightfall, the forward element of Task Force Drysdale received orders to use their still functioning vehicles to break through the Chinese lines.
And somewhere near 45 minutes or an hour before dark, both companies was pulled off those hills and told to get on a truck. On a convoy had been stalled all day. They couldn't go because we couldn't go on the little road. And they told us get on a truck and run over anybody that was ahead of us. That it's imperative that we got to Hagaru as quick as we could because we were about to lose that Hagaru.
While some Marines were finally showing signs of progress, others were trapped in a continually worsening situation.
We fought them off all night, and the next morning we had out of the 300, we had about 123 still standing. We had 40 dead in the ditches, and this was a mixture of Royal Marines, U.S. Marines, and the Army's Baker Company, the 27th or 7th Infantry Division, Baker Company 7th Infantry Division. And like I said, about 123 still standing, the rest dead or wounded in the ditches and freezing to death. The temperature was somewhere between 20 and 30 below zero.
Even the freezing temperatures could not stop the successive waves of Chinese soldiers descending upon the Marines.
I fired over 300 rounds of carbine ammunition that night, and because I knew how much I had under the seat of my truck, and I got back to the truck and got it, and I fired it all. And we had them stacked up like cordwood, the Chinese, but they just kept coming. And I had 1 or 2 rounds left. We had no grenades left, no machine guns, nothing like that. We had the regular troops had the M1 rifle, and the truck drivers had carbines. I had 2 rounds left, and I said, North Koreans are not going to take me. You know, I'm going to save that bullet for I'm not going through what they put people through. But there's always that will, at the last moment, that there's that will for survival. You're not supposed to shoot yourself, you know, you're supposed to survive.
Knowing that the trapped Marines were half frozen and running low on ammo, the Chinese offered them a chance to surrender.
Our senior officer by that time was a Marine major. And a couple of our people had been captured, and they sent him back up the road to talk to senior man and tell him, we're coming in before dawn. We know that dawn your airplanes will be out here. We're going to come in before dawn, and if you want to escape, then everybody gets dead. You know, no quarter given. So we talked it over, and the first time we didn't even realize it was Chinese, that they had entered in that many numbers. We thought we were still fighting North Koreans. Well, they had a very bad track record with prisoners, a lot of tortures and executions. So we told this major, we're not surrendering to North Koreans. So he goes back down there and talks to them. And at that time, he found out they were all Chinese. And he made a deal with them that if the rest of us surrendered, they would take our Chinese back, or take our wounded, I should say, back down to Kodori, a few miles down there, and let them get some proper treatment, that they wouldn't prevent them being rescued and taken back down, which they didn't. About 24 hours later, they let some convoys come up and get the wounded and the bodies out of there.
As elements of Task Force Drysdale were being led toward a Chinese prison camp, other members finally reached Hagaruri.
We got into Hagaru, I believe, probably around midnight or after. And everybody was so disorganized that nobody knew what was really going on. They didn't know what strength we still had. We had lost a lot of people. And we were put into when we run through the barricade that that was established there on the road. They put us into a very frozen field during the night.
During their mission, Task Force Drysdale sustained 162 casualties with an additional 159 wounded in battle. Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale was among those Marines who lost their lives during the operation. On November 30th, Major General Allman flew into Hagaru-ri to meet with General Smith. At this meeting, he ordered Smith to gather his troops and then head for the coast. The Marines would have to act quickly if they hoped to escape the Chinese vice. Smith was given permission to destroy all equipment that would slow his movements. While Smith recognized that his men were both outnumbered and surrounded, he refused to leave any equipment or wounded soldiers behind. His Marines would fight their way out of Shajin or die trying. As Smith's men were preparing to leave Hagaru-ri, 2 Marine regiments were struggling to reach the command post. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis led his 800 Marines from Udamni to Tatenkong Pass. When Chinese forces first attacked on November 27th, a single company of Marines had been sent to consolidate the pass. Now, nearly 5 days later, Davis's battalion was given orders to relieve them. If the Chinese had managed to overwhelm Fox Company, the Marines would be completely cut off from Hagaru-ri. The Marines traveled by daylight to take advantage of air and artillery support. At night they dug in and fought the Chinese and the bone-chilling cold. Once inside the pass, they found Fox Company still holding on. Despite being under constant attack for nearly 5 days, Fox Company had managed to hold out. Davis's men dug in on the high ground surrounding Fox Company's position, providing much-needed relief for the beleaguered Marines. Over 5 days, Fox Company had suffered 26 killed and another 89 wounded by Chinese soldiers. The sub-zero temperatures had also taken their toll. Of Fox Company's original 240 members, only 82 could still walk when Davis arrived on December 2nd. 62 of these Marines would later require amputations because of frostbite. As Davis's men secured the Tatenkong Pass, Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Taplett was leading the main body of Marines from Udamni. Even with close air support, Taplett's 3 rifle companies had been decimated during their journey. Of the 437 combat-able men that departed from Udamni 3 days before, only 194 remained. After the 2 Marine regiments were reunited on December 3rd, they prepared for the final stretch of their treacherous mission. They would have to travel an additional 7 miles through Chinese-occupied territory before reaching Hagaru-ri. As the Marines approached General Smith's forward command post later that evening, they paused to form ranks. With their last trace of energy, the Marines marched into Hagaru-ri singing the Marine hymn. By 2 p.m. on December 4th, the last elements of Traplett's rearguard had safely reached their destination. It had taken the Marines 79 hours to travel the 14-mile journey from Udamni to Hagaru-ri. They had carried almost 1,500 casualties with them, over a third of whom suffered from frostbite. With his remaining forces now fully assembled, Major General Smith prepared to depart from Hagaru-ri. UN helicopters spent an entire day transporting 4,312 wounded and badly frostbitten soldiers to safety. They also brought an additional 537 fresh reinforcements to assist with the planned breakout. From November 30th to December 4th, the 1st Marine Division had suffered 164 men killed, 55 missing in action, and an additional 921 wounded. Another 1,194 Marines were listed as non-battle casualties. After a day's worth of reorganization, Major General Smith's men prepared to move south towards Kotori. Before departing, a British correspondent asked the Major General if his men were retreating. Smith's response has since become firmly entrenched in Marine Corps lore. "Retreat, hell! We're just attacking in another direction."